Hello and welcome to this Partners in Care Mental Capacity Act webinar. Today we're doing webinar 9, and that's Managing Food and Diet. And I would like to introduce you to Lorraine Currie, who is an independent mental capacity consultant. And Lorraine is going to talk us through this very interesting subject. Over to you, Lorraine.
Okay, thanks, Karen. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to try and address in a very short time some of the issues around mental capacity, food and diet. So this has been incredibly challenging to just try and write something around this. It turned into kind of going down a rabbit hole, and a big warren opened up, and I thought, oh my goodness, what have I agreed to? This is huge. So I've had to try and make it not quite so huge. So first of all, I thought about why are we interested in this in any way? I thought about how is diet and food related to the MCA? Isn't this just something that speech and language therapy professionals decide? I thought about we've got sort of some people who don't want to eat, some people who don't want to stop eating. We've got issues about what we can do. We've also got a question of, isn't a healthy diet just something that we should think about for everyone? And then issues about what happens when family or, in fact, the person wants to ignore professional advice. So these are some of the things, the places that I went to, and you're going to come with me, whether you like it or not, really. So I looked about all of these things in detail, but there is a lot of documented evidence and research that particularly people with learning disabilities are more likely to experience health inequality. Interesting might be the wrong word, but it was interesting to me that the leading cause of death has moved from being respiratory to circulatory. And that kind of circulatory disease is something that diet's got a role in. So we're looking at that whole range of health inequalities. More data in case you needed it, but the first one here in particular I found quite shocking, that NHS digital data in 2022 showed significantly greater rates of obesity in those with a learning disability compared to the rest of the population. In the 18 to 24-year-old age range, just over 20% experienced obesity, compared with 3.4% in the rest of the population. That's quite a stark statistic. And then there's sort of further consideration about the range of issues affecting weight and diet, one of which is mental capacity. So balancing choice and the duty of care, and also supporters misusing the right to make unwise decisions in a way as an excuse not to help the person understand the risks and options of the diet they might be choosing to eat. And these, I can't remember completely what the abbreviation stand for, learning from deaths, and SIPOD, which you will be aware of, point out that the poor application of the MCA is a contributing factor to poor health outcomes. So there's a need to better understand the MCA to improve quality and length of life. You know, that's kind of a why does it matter? What's the MCA got to do with this? Well, better understanding of the MCA, its application in diet, is going to improve life and general well-being. And then again, you'll all be familiar with a regulatory requirement to make sure that people have adequate nutrition and hydration to sustain life. So all of these are the kind of reasons why it's important to look at the MCA in terms of looking at health and diet. I thought then about when issues arise, and sometimes issues arise, in my experience, specific to the disability. So things like Prader-Willi syndrome, brain injury leading to either a person not knowing when they're full or not knowing how to control impulsivity, end of life situations. Also, issues arise when the person's preferences and choice don't coincide with what's in their best interests. Also, issues arise when there are really significant risks around eating and drinking, and also when there are wider family conflicts. So I'm going to go through a bit of some of the documents that I found in doing this. All of this has been new to me, so it's been fantastic, really, bits of research. And then I'm going to come to some case studies at the end. So hopefully that'll help us look at some of these issues. What I can't do is I can't give speech and language advice. Those particular professionals, they're the experts. And I can't evaluate different types of feeding options. And I just needed to put that on a slide, really. That's not my area of expertise. It is the area of expertise of other professionals. So just to introduce you, if you haven't already met these various documents, I'm going to look at food refusal first. So this is when a person refuses to eat as opposed to when they're unable to eat. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be a protest. It might be to prompt an outcome. It might be due to physical or mental illness. But as I'll probably say on every slide, an individual speech and language assessment is required to look at the facts, the causes, the purpose of the behaviour. I found this in my search, and I think it's a really good document. It's a food refusal toolkit. And usually I skim through things and think, oh, that's not good, or that's out of date. But I found this to be really good. Very simple, very easy to follow. Also, you're going to find interactions here with adult safeguarding, and Karen's the expert on that. I'm not going to go into her arena, but this booklet talks through the fact that food refusal can be a form of self-neglect. And so we need to give consideration to that as an adult safeguarding issue when the person has care and support needs. The main question we would be asking around food refusal is whether the person has mental capacity to refuse food. And so, of course, a formal assessment of capacity is needed. All of these documents, like Karen said, will be made available. So as ever, our way forward in terms of food refusal or any of the issues we look at is an assessment of capacity for the specific decision. So we would be looking at the decision to refuse food. Is it a capacitor's choice? Do they understand the salient points of food refusal? Can they retain that information? Can they use and weigh the consequences? And can they communicate their decision? And then if they do have capacity, if they can make an unwise decision. If not, we would be looking at best interest decision making. But that will involve weighing the risks and benefits of the course of action the person is seeming to take. As I said, adults with mental capacity have got the right to make choices which others might think are unwise. And that can be refusing healthcare treatment, can be refusing to eat and drink. So proper application of MCA and things you'll all be familiar with, like making safeguarding personal, promote autonomy and choice. So this kind of application is always looking at the person's wishes and feelings and what we can do in any way to achieve what the person wants. But the challenges arise then when we have a duty of care towards the person because they're a resident in our care. And again, key to moving forward is keeping the wishes and feelings of the person at the forefront of all our decision making and interventions. This is another document that I came across, supporting people with eating and drinking difficulties. And this is new guidance from the Royal College of Physicians. And the link there is to on it on a website called Mental Capacity Law and Policy. But that'll take you to the document as well, and Karen will post it. Again, I found it really helpful, supporting people who have eating and drinking difficulties, a guide to practical care and clinical assistance, particularly towards the end of life. It's been fairly recently updated. It had a series of case studies at the end to help guide practice. It includes advice on this very difficult area where what the person wants to do, either with or without capacity, is to be provided with food and drink in a way which professionals feel they can't accommodate because of the risk. So what happens in those situations when the person may want to eat and drink solid food and the professional advice, is pureed diet? It gives a framework to working through these issues, seeking to sort of avoid just being risk averse, oh, there are risks, therefore, but to try and achieve balance, which also recognises that professionals have their own rights. And for you, managing some of these difficult situations can place you at risk. So it seeks to achieve a really good balance guidance. It talks about, of course, balancing capacity and incapacity, but balancing the rights of residents with the rights of professionals and how to balance those risks and benefits. I found it really helpful. It gives a framework where speech and language professionals will work with the person, with you as care providers and the family, to look at the balance of risk versus benefit. Because when we're talking about food, we're in an area where it's a pleasurable thing. For some people, not being able to eat is really, really challenging, not being able to eat what they want and how they want. And some people might want to accept those risks as if it leads to them eating what they want and how they want. And we'll look at some case studies in a minute. This looks at approaches to follow to reach the best decision, and how we get this sort of balance for the necessity of people to have food and fluid, and sometimes to put restrictions on that, but balance that against the pleasure of eating. So best interest decision making will not just be informed by risk, but also by the benefits that eating brings to offer. And then the final one that I came across, you can understand how I went down a rabbit warren because there were so many things to read, was eating and drinking with acknowledged risks. And this, again, highly recommend to you. So it's about a shared decision process where there are risks of eating, but how those risks are managed. And it talks about a number of risks that you'll all be familiar with: aspiration, malnutrition, dehydration, and choking, for example. But it looks at the not sort of solutions, but a framework for decision making that involves everyone and then weighs up those risks and the benefits. It's like him out of the office. Anyway, it's nothing to do with anything. So it talks about shared decision making when it is eating and drinking, and there are acknowledged risks. It follows best practice, so correct legal frameworks, evidence-based practice, and then the law around mental capacity and consent. And it involves all of the relevant people and multidisciplinary decision making, because sometimes it may be the family who think that the person can still continue to eat, and the family might be the ones who want to bring in or give them something against professional advice. As ever, it's about supporting decision making. So a person with capacity can choose to make a decision which appears to be unwise or actually is unwise. That could include a decision that they want to receive food in a way that increases their risk to general health. But a person with capacity can generally do that There are some exceptions. I'm going to talk through a case in a minute or two. It might be that a person who lacks capacity in relation to weighing the risks of eating and drinking still wants to receive food in a way that poses a risk to them. And we can't just automatically go down the risk-based route. We do need to balance the risks with the benefit to the person of being able to eat food in a way they want. Decision making involves all the relevant professionals. It involves assessing capacity in relation to the risks of eating and drinking. It involves working out actually what is it you're trying to achieve, what is the goal of intervening, taking into account the person's wishes and balancing those risks in best interest decision making. And then if all of that has been properly considered in best interest decision making, and those need to act on that outcome will be protected from liability. So it's the importance of ever of the reasonable belief the person lacks capacity in relation to the decision, the reasonable belief as to what is in their best interest, and the protection from liability that follows. Okay, so that's sort of my introduction in a way to some of the issues. And then I'm just going to look at some cases that pick out a number of these issues and then come round to a summary. So this was a fascinating case, and you might notice that this case involved Spectrum Community Healthcare, and they were the organisation who have written the first booklet that I showed you. So this was a case where the person had capacity. It's still very, very interesting. So this man had a rare genetic condition, was quadriplegic and without teeth. So his cognitive and communication skills were unimpaired, but his physical ability was limited to pushing a button with one finger. Since 2016, he'd been bedbound and wholly dependent on care staff for all personal care and feeding. He was in a supine position, a very posh word. You can tell I've copied it from somewhere and pasted it. I think that means he's lying down. He was serving a lengthy sentence of imprisonment, and he was in the healthcare wing at HMP Liverpool, cared for by Spectrum Community Healthcare. So you get the picture of this man who has only got one finger that he can. Because of his condition, he can pose risk of death or serious injury by choking or aspiration, some foods more than others. Until 2021, he had a mixed diet of soft and non-soft foods. Meals were sent to his cell, and he then decided whether he was capable of eating them. He would regularly supplement his diet with snacks from the prison canteen, including boiled sweets. This real whole thing is about boiled sweets. But his team became increasingly concerned at his risk of choking. Following a speech and language therapy assessment, they then began denying him any foods which didn't fall within the so-called level 6 diet of soft and bite-sized foods. He wanted to be able to eat boiled sweets, crisps, and biscuits, and responded by refusing all food in protest, and he challenged their decision by way of judicial review. So they advanced the decision to refuse treatment, confirming that food refusal was to apply even when his life was at risk. He didn't wish to be ventilated or to have CPR. He described in this process how he has little or no quality of life. He's completely bedbound, lying on his back for 24 hours a day, unable to do anything for himself other than call for help or control the television. He concluded that he lost almost everything in his life, and being able to eat what he wants represents my last shred of humanity and dignity. I want to be able to cling on to it for as long as I can. So the issue that came before the court is whether it was lawful for a medical professional to restrict the foods that were offered to him, because in their medical opinion, offering him boiled sweets, crisps and biscuits would expose him to a high risk of choking and might lead to his death. The court considered guidance, actually looking at some of the things that I've just shared with you, and that there needed to be a sort of calibration between being risk averse and, on the other hand, placing carers in an impossible position in the name of patient autonomy. The alternative argument put forward on his behalf was that this was about choice and that this choice shouldn't have been overridden in relation to what food he eats, because he has capacity and he understands and accepts the risk he faces of choking to death if he eats boiled sweets. The judge found that actually what Spectrum had concluded was correct, that they were not legally obliged to provide something that wasn't clinically indicated. And he refers to another decision of the Supreme Court, which had sort of come up in between this case being heard, and that it concluded what treatment was reasonable to offer is a matter of professional skill and judgment on behalf of those offering the treatment. The judge said one can fully understand the dire situation in which he finds himself, and that he understands and is happy to take the risk of choking for the modest pleasure of eating a boiled sweet, then that's a matter for him. It may be that in certain different circumstances, the balance would come down in his favour, but not in this case, because he cannot feed himself. He cannot obtain boiled sweets from the prison shop. He cannot unwrap them and put them in his own mouth. The provision of boiled sweets where he can into his mouth is different. It is treatment or care carrying with it considerable risk that on any day, giving him a boiled sweet might cause him to choke to death. I mean, that's quite extreme. So in my judgment, this judge says it was correct the first time around to conclude that it was lawful for Spectrum to refuse to provide JJ with boiled sweets in circumstances in which they had done so. Had they provided sweets and he choked to death or suffered serious harm, then they would be at more than fanciful risk of prosecution under Regulation 12, CQC, or in the criminal courts for negligence and manslaughter. So a man with capacity wants to eat boiled sweets, is saying he's willing to accept the risk. Professional advice is no, not to have boiled sweets. And because of that involvement of carers in unwrapping and feeding in those boiled sweets, the judge rules that it is not lawful for him to have them. I mean, you've got to think about it on many levels, but it's quite a sad sort of case. So a little bit closer to home, I want to share another case with you, and then I'm going to swap some things around and see what we think then. So this is Morris, who was a senior lecturer in his working life. In his mid-70s now, he finds himself living alone, but he still retains contacts and friendships with his ex-wife and wider family. Had a stroke, was admitted to hospital. As a result of the stroke, he's now immobile. He's transferred by hoist. He's got good communication, but he's disorientated and lacking capacity for care decisions. On discharge, he's transferred to nursing home. He has the speech and language assessment because he's got swallowing difficulties post-stroke. That assessment is carried out in the hospital. It identifies an aspiration risk and a pureed diet with level 3 thickened fluids. In addition, he's vegetarian. A dose assessment is then commenced in the nursing home, and he complains about the food, asking why he can't have real food. The dose assessor acknowledges that this is a real risk for him. His ex-wife, who's still visiting him, is a retired senior nurse. She also thought the pureed diet was no longer appropriate. The speech and language assessment is by now 6 months old. and was carried out in hospital. So it simply sort of followed him to the care home and been continued. So the BIA sets a condition for the care home to request an updated speech and language assessment. That came out, and the outcome was normal food and diet. So again, it's a sort of MCA related issue. He has not got capacity around his care and support needs, but he is able to say what his wishes and feelings are. And in all honesty, I don't think it should have took a BIA to say you need to request a new assessment. But bear in mind that these are the experts and they are your way to managing food and diet in many ways. So what I just want to do is to change some of those things around for this man. So let's imagine everything's the same. Morris is still somebody who was a senior lecturer, has had a stroke, he's admitted to hospital, he's now immobile, hoist transferred, good communication, but lacks capacity around care decisions, on discharge, transferred to care home. Swallowing difficulties post-stroke, assessment carried out in hospital, aspiration risk identified, pureed diet, thickened fluids, this is déjà vu, and he's vegetarian. He complains, asking why he can't have real food, but let's change this up and to say, let's imagine that his ex-wife thinks the pureed diet is not appropriate and she's bringing in his favourite cheese pasties. The speech and language assessment is now 6 months old. The BIA sets a condition for an updated assessment. Imagine that now confirms that he does need to remain on a pureed diet, that the aspiration and the choking risk continues. And let's imagine that his ex-wife refuses to accept that and continues to bring in cheese pasties. That's not a picture you want to see when it's getting near lunchtime. So let's imagine that she's still bringing in the cheese pasties. So what happens now? So what I would suggest is that a way forward would be to hold a best interest meeting with speech and language professionals present. This will allow his ex-wife to express her views and what she thinks his views are, but it will also give her a good opportunity to hear from professionals, to hear what they're saying about why he still needs a pureed diet. Together, everyone can look at this balance between the very real risks, but the pleasure that is derived from eating and whether there's any sort of middle ground. If this is unsuccessful, then maybe there are two further things that follow. One is to think about, is there a risk of abuse here? If he's being fed incorrectly against advice, and if the best interest outcome has supported that ongoing. And then there may be further questions about whether contact needs to be limited or supervised. And that's a bit of a cliffhanger till March, when we're going to talk about contact and limiting contact and so on. So that's a framework really to try and work with somebody who finds it very difficult to accept that the person, because probably a very short while before, this was somebody who could eat and drink normally. And it's very hard for them to come to terms with the changes that have occurred post-stroke and with a loss of mental capacity as well. So what about balancing diet and weight? Can we force an adult to eat healthily? Well, no. Sometimes we wish we could, but we can't. But there is a key role here for education, understanding diet and health, especially when it impacts wider health issues like mobility can be significantly impacted by being overweight. Some of the way forward is, of course, around assessing capacity and best interest decision making. Also trying to agree together dietary restrictions, trying to put to somebody, this is the healthy eating option, this one is not quite so healthy. Can we agree some of this? If the person doesn't have capacity around their diet, then can we look at best interest decision making, but make sure we're including in that some of the pleasure as well as the risks and benefits. And actually asking ourselves, isn't it easier if we just offer healthy options rather than the kind of full fat option and the low fat option, and the high sugar and the low sugar? Sometimes address that by just making sure we have healthy food on offer. So I want to kind of try and pick this up with another case example. It's called donuts. The other one was called boiled sweets. This one's called donuts. So this is John, a young man who had a brain injury 4 years ago, has ongoing issues with early diabetes, as well as issues with memory, which affect planning sequencing. He's very articulate and communicates well. Support staff have been doing some work with John about diet. He's considered to be 3 stone overweight, and medical advice is to reduce his weight to prevent further issues with diabetes management. Staff are seeking to test that he understands the implications of eating certain foods in relation to weight and diabetes. During the session, John can easily and correctly identify the food that he should and shouldn't eat in order to follow a healthy diet and to manage his diabetic condition. He can express this verbally. He can select pictures which support his understanding of a healthy diet. When he's given menus or food planners, he can select the healthy eating option and explain to staff why this is the right choice. It's all sounding great. We're veering towards mental capacity around food and diet, but John is supported when he goes out. But if the route they walk passes a cake shop, John will immediately rush in and buy a pack of donuts, which he will eat before the support worker can even consider whether they need to intervene. After the event, John is unable to explain why he did that, and he'll affirm that he understands why he shouldn't eat 6 donuts because he needs to lose weight and manage diabetes. So what we've got is he's able to understand the relevant information, he's able to retain it, but we're really questioning whether he can use and weigh that information, whether he can apply that information at the time it needs to be applied. If it happened once, we might say it's an unwise decision, which we all make from time to time. We all think, right, I shouldn't have that, and then we do, we eat it. But in John's case, it happens every time. Similar issues arise if he's anywhere near a vending machine and there's nobody there to sort of persuade him to walk away. He will select and eat several Mars bars. So we're seeing this kind of impulsivity as a result of his brain injury affect his ability to use and weigh information that he has understood and retained. This basis, staff consider that he lacks capacity in relation to his diet and food choices, because although he can understand the relevant information, he can't use or weigh it at the time he needs to because of poor impulse control arising from his brain injury. But it's not game over. But then that's it. You can never have any sweet things ever again. We will take over all your decision making and just give you gruel and muesli, and that's it. Staff are working with him on impulse control strategies. So there may be ways of saying you can have a Mars bar at this time if these things apply. We can work with him to try and ensure that he gains capacity over his food and diet choices, with the aim in the future of him being able to make his own decisions around diet and food. So, in summary, which I think might be my last slide. Like I say, this isn't a presentation I've done before, so I didn't know how long it was going to take. Eating and drinking may bring many challenges in a care setting around refusing food, eating inappropriately, eating with risks, and ignoring advice. Mental capacity ensures a model for decision making, and that is a model which not only assesses capacity around decision making, but in the best interest part of the process, it weighs not only the risks, but the benefits and the positive aspects of the pleasure that food brings. The role of speech and language therapy professionals is key, and there is also this potential interaction with adult safeguarding. And that is the end of my little bit before we move on to questions. Thank you.
So on behalf of Partners in Care, Lorraine, thank you for taking us through that around managing food and diet. I'm sure it's left us with some points to ponder on. So thank you, everyone.